Hello and welcome to Space Talk with the American Astronautical Society. I am Dr. Amir Gohardani, the host of Space Talk and the editor-in-chief of Space Times. And today I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming Dr. Kris Lehnhardt, element scientist for exploration medical capability for the Human Research Program at NASA Johnson Space Center. The topic of our talk is medical capabilities for deep space exploration. Welcome to Space Talk, Dr. Lehnhardt.
Thank you very much, Amir. It's a pleasure to be here.
The pleasure is mine. This is a very, very intriguing and interesting topic, Dr. Lehnhardt. And before diving into the details, can you tell us a little bit about your educational background?
Certainly, I'm happy to. So first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. As you see on the slide, I'm a medical doctor, and I also work at NASA. And so my education and background started in biomedical sciences. I'm originally from Canada, and so I did all of my undergraduate and medical and residency training in Canada, and I started at somewhere called the University of Guelph. And so that was a 4-year program learning all about the interface between biology and medicine and physiology. And from that training, I then went on to medical school at Western University. And so I completed 4 years of medical school, and I had an interest in space medicine. But in Canada, there is no formal training program for space medicine. So I instead chose to pursue emergency medicine as my primary specialty. And I did my emergency medicine residency also at Western University.
That's fascinating. And special welcome to you because you're actually the first medical doctor we have at Space Talk. So that's awesome. It's just very intriguing to me. So let us talk a little bit about the Human Research Program. And really what I'm interested to see is how your journey has now been shaped now that you actually can deal with space-related topics.
Yeah, it's fascinating. My journey to this world is a long and convoluted one. I've always been interested in medical care in austere environments. And so that started out with an interest in aviation medicine and diving medicine and wilderness medicine. But my true passion, my ultimate goal was always to be involved in space medicine and in the space medicine world. And so for me, my path to that world is through research. And so now the job that I have as the element scientist for exploration medical capability in the Human Research Program is to try and help the Human Research Program to prepare for taking care of people in deep space, on the moon and on Mars ultimately. And so what you see here on the screen is an example of how the Human Research Program approaches this problem. So we as humans, we're not meant to be in space. And so we are using our big brains and our adaptable physiology to learn how to live and thrive in the space environment. And so we've become very good at that on the International Space Station over the last 20 years. But HRP's primary mandate is to prepare NASA for Mars missions from a human research perspective. And so the way that we do that is through a stepwise progression, which you see here. We start with research on people and their bodies and their minds on the ground in analog environments. So different places that have similarities in some way to spaceflight, but are not entirely the same as spaceflight. We then take that research and we adapt it for low Earth orbit. And we then do studies and demonstrations on the International Space Station that are meant to help us better prepare for those deep space missions. As we're moving forward now, we're taking all of our research from the space station and we're starting to adapt it for the moon. And so our goal in these lunar missions is to become more Earth independent as a stepping stone towards Mars.
And you mentioned Mars, and certainly Artemis is a very important step in that direction. So can you tell us a little bit about the details here?
Yeah, so the initial Artemis missions are our opportunity as NASA to go back to the moon and to start to prepare ourselves, if you will, for more sustainable exploration. The Apollo program did wonderful things, but in and of itself, it was not sustainable. And that's one of the reasons why when the Apollo program ended, NASA pivoted towards the space shuttle and the space station. But now that we're going back to the moon, the idea behind Artemis is that every mission is meant to be increasingly complex and more difficult. And so what you see here on the screen is the buildup of the Artemis missions. So over time, when we do Artemis 2, we're going to fly people in the Orion capsule into deep space. On Artemis 3, we're going to take people back to the surface of the moon. And then once we get to Artemis 4, we're going to start to build up our infrastructure, both in lunar orbit and on the lunar surface. So if you start from the left, the Gateway space station is starting to be built around in cislunar space around the moon. And on that space station, we're going to start to be able to fly astronauts for extended periods of time. So we're going to start with maybe a few weeks, but then ultimately we're going to end up with months in deep space on Gateway. During this time with each of these missions, we're also going to start to build up our surface assets. And so you'll see here unpressurized rovers and pressurized rovers and surface habitats. All of these capabilities are necessary for the first human Mars mission. And so between what we do in lunar orbit and on the lunar surface, we're going to fly increasingly complex systems and vehicles. We're going to have increasingly complex missions, and every one of these missions is meant to be a stepping stone towards a Mars mission.
Yes, and I presume a lot of this comes with at least a significant medical risk, and certainly the harsh space environment doesn't make life easy. So how does that impact us overall as humans?
I would say that we've actually become pretty good at taking care of people in space on the space station. So our current state, which you see here on the screen, of 6 month to 1 year missions with lots of consumables resupply, real-time communications, and the possibility for emergency evacuation means that our paradigm, our way of thinking about medicine in space is such that we don't have a significant amount of medical capability on the space station today. If a significant event were to occur in space where someone became sick or injured, our plan is to stabilize them on the space station and then bring them home as quickly as possible. And so in the medical world, this is called a scoop and run. Whereas for an exploration class mission, that simply is not possible. So if we think about a Mars mission, it's a 2 to 3 year mission. There's no ability to resupply that mission. So if you forgot something or ran out of something, then unfortunately, too bad for you. There's no ability for real-time communications on a Mars mission. There are significant time delays back and forth between the vehicle and Earth. And there's no evacuation possible. Once you start towards Mars, because of vehicle design and fuel and orbital mechanics, there's no way to come home again quickly if something bad happens. And so our approach to a Mars mission, because that risk is going to increase with that distance from Earth, our approach to the Mars mission is that we have to have a significantly expanded onboard medical capability. And so In the medical world, we call that stay and play. So we're going to have to go from a scoop and run approach, which we use now on the space station, to a stay and play approach on a Mars mission, which requires a lot more medical capability in space.
Yes, and on that topic, can you tell us a little bit about the exploration medical capability?
Absolutely. So this is the group that I work for at NASA. And our job is to advance medical system design and risk-informed decision-making. So what that means is that we need to help NASA to make good decisions about what a medical system should look like in the future, what knowledge, skills, and abilities we have to have on board to take care of the astronauts during these missions. And ultimately, we have to help them to figure out what the right stuff is to take with us. We can't take a hospital to space. So our job is to try and predict all the bad things that can happen and design a medical system around that. And the way that we do that is through interdisciplinary teams. We've realized, and NASA has realized in general, that to have a new, more robust system in the future, our team is made up of engineers and scientists and doctors all working together to design future systems.
Wonderful. And with regards to this analysis that certainly has to be conducted, and the research that needs to be done, given that you can't, as you explained, take a hospital with you, what are the ways in which we can pursue this as a tactical step?
This is a really interesting area of research right now because we are Earth reliant on the space station. We gather lots of different samples from people, from research, for medical purposes on the space station. But our ability to analyze them in space is actually very limited. So we can probably do less in space from a medical analysis perspective than you could do at a normal primary care doctor's office on Earth. And that has worked very well for the space station because of our proximity to Earth, but it's not the way that the future is going to have to work, because on a Mars mission, the astronauts are going to have to be able to take care of themselves. And so one of our team's areas of focus right now is on this in situ analysis. And we want to be able to test new capabilities in space flight that will allow us to do analysis at the point of care, where the patient is, where the astronaut is in space, and then use that information to treat them on the spot for whatever condition they may have.
Yes, and an example of that is maybe looking at the white blood cells, isn't it? And
yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about how this ties into this type of analysis?
Yes, absolutely. I'd be happy to. I think this is a great example of taking Earth technology and modifying it for spaceflight. So the device you see here is a white blood cell analyzer called the HemaQ. And it's a point of care test device that we can use in a hospital or in a clinic, where they take a little bit of your blood and they put it into the machine. And the machine will then tell you what your white blood cell count is and what the differential is. That's the different types of cells that are within your white blood cell count. And we can use this information to diagnose infection, to assess the severity of an injury, or even to look at radiation exposure. It's never existed in space before, the ability to do white blood cell analysis. And so what we did is we took this device from Earth and we modified it for the microgravity and space environment. And what we learned doing that is that not only do we have to modify the device substantially, but we also have to modify the procedures for using the device, because they are all gravity dependent. And so you see here one of our NASA astronauts, Kate Rubins, she's the one who successfully did the test with this device. But prior to our successful test, we'd had one test that did not work properly. And that's because our procedures were too gravity dependent and they didn't work in the microgravity environment. So a big part of our testing in space of new technologies and demonstrations of new technologies is not only to make sure that the hardware works properly, but we need the protocols and procedures in place to use the hardware effectively to get the answers that we need. So if you're interested in learning more, we've published a paper that you see here on the screen that outlines this technology demonstration and the results from that research.
That's wonderful, and I'm very happy that you highlighted that there is actually a link between what we do here on Earth and space, but also that we need to kind of tailor and redesign some of these devices so they work in the space environment. Just out of curiosity, how many times would an astronaut need to check their white blood cells? Is there a protocol around that at this point, or an envisioned protocol?
So there is no protocol around that at this point, because the belief again is that this is a test that can be conducted on Earth if an astronaut becomes sick or injured. So it's never been a capability that we've had on the space station or potentially even needed on the space station. And so our ability to use station as a place to do these technology demonstrations is invaluable before we go into deep space. But it's a new capability that has not previously been used in the space environment.
Thank you for pointing that out. So I guess one of these items that equally as important is to have the medical procedures support. So can you elucidate a little bit more on this topic and talk to us a little bit about what examples of medical procedure support is available today?
Yes, happy to. I think that this one is really important because not every space mission has a doctor on board. And there's no guarantee in the future that our deep space exploration missions are going to have a doctor on board. And in many cases, a lot of the medical technology and capabilities that we fly to space require a higher level of training. So for example, we have equipment on the space station for putting a tube down someone's throat and hooking them up to a ventilator in case they can't breathe properly. But if no one on board is capable of placing that tube because they don't have the training, then it's not going to be a useful technology or capability for us. So for our Mars missions in particular, we want to ensure that we can provide the astronauts with tools that they can use to perform complex medical procedures in a meaningful and successful way without necessarily having to have all of the training of a medical doctor.
And that brings us to autonomous medical officer support.
Yes, exactly. So this is a software package that we've developed at NASA. In developing it, we weren't necessarily trying to identify the end solution for this problem, but what we really needed was a prototype, something we could use for testing purposes. And we had to be able to demonstrate that astronauts can do complex medical procedures without significant ground support. Right now, if someone were to have a need to do an ultrasound in space, for example, we have real-time experts on Earth in mission control who guide the astronauts step by step how to do those procedures. And that only works because our communications between Earth and the space station are real time. The moment that you start to introduce many seconds or minutes of delays, then trying to do that real time guidance becomes almost impossible. So what AMOS is a software that you can see if you scan the QR code on the screen. It was designed to allow us to do any number of complex medical procedures without real-time ground support. But the initial test case module that we created for AMOS was a kidney and bladder ultrasound device, or module, I should say. And that That technology, that ability for astronauts to do their own ultrasounds has not been done in space before without Earth guidance. So what you can see here in the picture is we took one of our astronauts who is not medically trained, and we asked her to power up this software and turn on the ultrasound device. And we then functionally turned off the radios to the ground. And we said, only follow the software. You're on your own. We need you to get medically diagnostic quality ultrasound pictures of the kidneys and the bladder. And the first few pictures that she took, frankly, were not great, but that's because she didn't have any training on how to do an ultrasound. But within less than an hour, she was returning to the ground high quality diagnostic images of the kidneys and the bladder using the software and the ultrasound device. And so what this test showed is that astronauts are pretty smart and capable people. And if you give them the tools that they need to perform their tasks, even if they don't have real-time ground support, they can ultimately be successful. And so what we're going to do now in the future is develop more modules to test in space. And we're going to start to push the limits of what types of complex medical procedures astronauts can perform without ground support. But our initial demonstration proved that with the right tools and training, the astronauts, even if they're not doctors, can perform some of the doctor functions on deep space missions.
That's simply fascinating what you shared with us. Dr. Lehnhardt, I'm curious to know if what you have developed in Amos with regards to additional procedures, as you put it, would that impact the astronaut training, given that maybe it's a way for astronauts to get a pre-peek or a sneak peek to this tool, so they're more familiar and not as unfamiliar as this case for the first pictures?
That is a great point, Amir. I think that there's a lot of restrictions on astronaut time on the ground with respect to training. And so one of the ideas that we have with this type of software tool is, just as you said, if we can familiarize them with the tool on the ground, then they could use it to perform any number of procedures in space. And so they wouldn't have to necessarily learn how to do each of those procedures on the ground, as long as they had familiarity with the software and the tools they would have in space. They would be able to do just-in-time training or refresher training on any number of complex medical procedures in flight.
Very interesting. So with the next step here is probably to look at the data, right? You do that every day, obviously, due to your research. So can you tell us a little bit about the onboard data integration for decision support? Because when I first saw the Amos basically segment that you shared, I wonder if it's based on heuristics or if it's based on experiments that you have done in the past in which to make the decision points. So I'm very curious about that. If you can highlight some key points in that regard, I would appreciate it.
Yes, happily. So the Amos work does come out of previous research that we've done, both here on the ground and in space, looking at what level of knowledge, skills, and abilities someone would need to provide medical care in a remote or austere environment. So we have lots of examples of that are not space related all over the planet. But we have done some dedicated studies in the past looking at an astronaut-like population and what types of knowledge, skills, and abilities they would have to have for complex medical procedures. So that is something that is critical to future systems, is having that ability to have integrated training tools and procedure support tools. What we're talking about here on the screen now is another capability that we believe is necessary for future medical systems, and that is the ability to integrate onboard data. So if you go to a hospital right now and you were to see, I work in the emergency department, for example, so I hope I never have to see any of you in the hospital because you don't want to see me in the hospital. But if we do see you, we're going to have all of this information about you, CAT scans, blood tests, vital signs, all these different things. And they all amalgamate into a central system where we can see all the data in one place. That is not the way we do spaceflight right now. All spaceflight health and medical data is collected in space on different devices and using different tools, and it's all sent to the ground. And on the ground, people then take it, integrate it, and start to store it in medical records and in other places. And that approach works very well for the space station. But when we're talking about a Mars mission, one of the things that the crew will need is they will need access to information so that they can then use that information to make decisions about their health and well-being. And so this work here is focused on how can we integrate health, medical, and performance data in space for the astronauts to use it to make decisions.
Wonderful. And I can just see AI blinking here in some capacity, but can you tell us a little bit about the integrated data architecture? And I know that you shed a little bit light on that, but maybe walk us through the pictorial if you can, please.
Absolutely. So what you see here is a schematic of what this could look like. There would be a central way for us to gather data. We're interested in all the data about the astronauts on board. So they may be wearing personal devices like this that transmit to this system. We may do medical tests or screening procedures on them in space, and that data would all flow to this system. We would have onboard information about all of their nutritional status, all the food they're eating, all the exercise they're doing. All of that could flow into this system. And then importantly, we would also want vehicle information and data to flow into the system. We want to know the status or the state of the vehicle at all times in terms of pressure, oxygen, carbon dioxide, radiation levels, whether or not there's any smoke or fire on board. All of that would all amalgamate into this one space. And ultimately, what we would want to have is we want to have the people on board have access to this information. And then as close to real time as possible, we would want the people on the ground to also have access to this information. So we're really looking at an integrated system in the vehicle itself, but a system that is also very tightly linked to the ground so that if someone on the ground notices a problem that no one in space notices, they can notify the crew, and vice versa. The crew may notice a problem before anyone else does, and they can start to act on it before the ground will have time to respond. So this type of system is necessary for integrating and storing and scrubbing all of the data related to health and performance. But Amir, to your point, the next evolution, the next step of that, once you have all that data, is you want to analyze it. And you want that analysis to be going on real time in the background to notify the astronauts if a problem is detected. And so decision support tools and AI tools that can do that advanced analytics on that data and can notify the astronauts of a problem that they may not otherwise be aware of is the ultimate objective that we're trying to reach here with the integrated data architecture project.
Thank you for highlighting that. And I think it's just fascinating how a smaller problem can just explode to something gigantic and equally explored in the same way. So very, very fascinating.
Another area of interest for XMC is how can we make the most efficient use of everything that we have on board? So right now on the space station, for example, we've become very good at recycling water. And so that means that we don't have to fly as much water to space because we're able to reclaim it very effectively. One of the things, though, that we are less efficient with is using other onboard resources. So an example that I'll give you is we now fly medical oxygen separate from the oxygen that the vehicle has for the atmosphere. And in the future, flying multiple oxygen sources is not the most efficient way of doing a mission to Mars. So an area that we are particularly interested in is how can we make the best use of every possible resource on board. An example that I'll give you here is intravenous fluids. On Earth, if you go to a hospital and you need an IV, they'll take a bag of fluid and they'll hook it up to tubing and they'll put it into your veins. And that bag of fluid is made in a factory and is shipped to the hospital. When we fly bags of fluid to space, we don't often use intravenous fluids, but we need it in case of an emergency. That fluid is mass and volume. And so every time we fly that to space, we're using mass and volume on our vehicles in order to do that. For a Mars mission, when we try to anticipate how many bags of IV fluid we might need, it ends up being dozens and dozens of bags of fluid. And every one of those bags of fluid comes with an expiration date that is potentially shorter than the Mars mission. So you may end up with all of this expired IV fluid that you need at the end of the Mars mission, and you're not sure if it's safe or effective to use. So a more efficient way of doing that in the future could be making our own intravenous fluids in space. And so we've done this now on the space station as a technology demonstration. We built special hardware to take drinking water on the space station and purify it, take all the bubbles out, sterilize the water, and then mix salts into the water so that it can be used as intravenous fluid. And in the future, what we're hoping to do is take the same capability, miniaturize it, and integrate it with environmental control and life support systems so that if and when someone needs intravenous fluids on board the space station or a vehicle going to Mars, you would simply have to flip a switch and the machine would start to make intravenous fluids, and you would take the tubing from the patient, hook it up to the vehicle, and it would start to give them pure IV fluids from that drinking water on board. So this is one of the ways in which we're trying to more efficiently use the resources that we have on board our vehicles in the future.
Fascinating. And you touch upon this topic about mass and volume, and this brings us to the backpack problem, which to me is really, really interesting. So, and it's part of course, the system engineering aspect. So can you tell us a little bit about that based on what you just described?
Absolutely. The backpack problem is not a medical challenge. It's an optimization problem. It's a math problem for all intents and purposes. And what this basically means is that everything that we fly to space has a cost, not necessarily a money cost, although everything costs money, but in space, mass, power, volume, data, these are the resources that are truly precious in spaceflight. And one of the things we have to be able to do is find a way to identify the optimal solution for a medical system in the future. And what that means is that we want a medical system that maximizes value while minimizing resource cost. And so what that boils down to for us is we can fly a really large medical system, but the mass and volume that medical system takes up is going to then take mass and volume away from other systems, which may end up having a negative impact on the people or on the mission. So the optimization problem that is the backpack problem applies to medical system design, but it actually applies to the design of every system on the vehicle. And the vehicle itself is a system of systems that needs optimization as well. And so solving the backpack problem for medical system design is an area that my team works on regularly.
Wonderful. And I guess you have some examples of this here with regards to that in at least low Earth orbit.
Exactly. And every example that you see here is a solution to the backpack problem that makes sense for that given mission. So whether we go from Apollo to the space shuttle to the space station, as we go through these different missions, they have more people on board, they become longer and longer over time, and they become increasingly complex in their mission objectives. And as a result, the medical system on board becomes more complex with each given mission. So for our Apollo missions, our astronauts did not need a significant amount of medical supplies. For our space shuttle missions, you see here that the number of capabilities starts to increase. And then finally, with our space station example, we have a much more robust medical system that's aligned with the space station missions, but is still based upon the proximity to Earth of the space station. And so the medical system you see for the space station still really has that scoop and run approach in its design.
And it's an excellent point you make, because with the envision human habitats, right? So this type of overall thinking needs to fundamentally change, as you pointed out in one of your earlier slides. So wonderful. What about the medical system architecture?
I think this is a really important point, because I think one of the things we've learned at NASA and we've seen historically is that when we ask engineers to design medical systems without subject matter expert inputs, we don't end up with an optimal system. When we ask medical doctors to design medical systems without engineering inputs, we don't end up with an optimal system. So the approach that we've taken in XMC is that this has to be done in a truly interdisciplinary manner. And that point in the middle is exactly right. The team has to work really closely together. So what you see in the medical domain is you see the subject matter experts identifying what are the planned activities we know are going to occur from a medical perspective. What are the conditions that we believe are most likely to occur in the spaceflight environment? And what are the capabilities that the system has to have in order to take care of those both planned and unplanned medical events? And we take all that information and we merge it with everything from our engineering group. The engineering group looks at all of the design reference mission inputs. They identify all of the mission and NASA requirements that need to be taken into account for a given mission. And they develop a concept of operations for the medical system for that mission. And that concept of operations essentially identifies the vision of what that medical system should be able to do during that mission. And you then can functionally decomposition that concept of operations into a set of system functions that the medical system has to be able to perform. And it's the fusion of the functions with the capabilities that define the requirements of the system. And it's only when we get to the green boxes that we truly have an interdisciplinary solution.
Yes, and Dr. Lehnhardt, I love this slide, because it shows that in the future we definitely need people who are capable of navigating this intersection with, for instance, between systems engineering and the medical domain. And that requires a special skill sets to be actually cross-disciplinary, which is very, very important. And I'm so happy that you highlighted this problem, that you wouldn't get the optimal solution if these domains would work in silo. And now you need to have this type of interdependence between the domains to actually get to an optimal solution. So thank you for pointing that out. And here's, I guess, a overview of the medical system model. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So what our team has done, NASA is fundamentally an engineering organization. And so we realized that in order for the medical system to be designed in the way that we believe is most effective, we have to be able to take our medical information and communicate it in the language of engineering. And so what is on the screen here is that interpretation, if you will. We've used a model-based system engineering approach to capture all of the high-level system vision and scope. So that's the concept of operations for the system, all of the standards and NASA documents that we've followed for the development of the system, and the list of all the conditions that have been identified as having either the highest likelihood or the highest consequence for a given mission. At the next level down, we can see how those functions and the capabilities come together to create the requirements documents. And then from the requirements level, we also can identify system architecture information. So an example there would be, how does the medical system have to interface with other vehicle systems? So if I need oxygen from the vehicle to treat a sick patient, I need an interface from the medical system to the vehicle system to get that oxygen. And then we can also see resource lists, which are all the stuff that you would need to bring with you for this medical system to be effective. And you can generate a master equipment list. And using that master equipment list, you can determine what the mass and volume, power, and data requirements are for this system. And you can see how that fits into the system of systems that is the vehicle. And so if you go to the QR code on the screen, this will take you to two of our medical system models that we've created. One is for a short duration cislunar mission, and one is for a long duration lunar orbit and lunar surface mission. And our hope is that these models will help to communicate more effectively what we believe the medical system should look like for exploration missions, but in a language that our engineering colleagues can use and understand to actually design and build these systems in the future.
So Dr. Lehnhardt, based on what you just described, every type of mission, does it have a specific medical system that's optimized for that specific space mission? Is that what's envisioned in the future?
That's the hope. And so if you look back at some of the exploration missions in the past, if you look at the Apollo missions, for example, or the Mercury and Gemini missions, each subsequent mission, they made changes not only to the medical capabilities on board, but to the vehicles themselves in a lot of ways. And so our hope with the Artemis missions from a medical system perspective is that because the requirements and the objectives for each mission are different, that we want to be able to help identify the optimal system for each of those missions. We may not always get the optimal system on board, but we should be able to identify where we can improve our systems with each subsequent mission in a way that will better take care of the astronauts on board and help ensure mission success.
Wonderful. Dr. Lehnhardt, we have arrived at one of our last portions here of our very important portion related to really your life as an element scientist or a medical doctor, because you serve in multiple functions in your daytime job or daytime jobs. So I wonder if you can please share a little bit about your vision when it comes to your career, but also reflect upon maybe some key takeaways for people who are either interested in space-related topics or in the medical field, or an intersection of medical field and space. Of course, I know that you're very big in aquanautics and a lot of other endeavors that you're part of, but any type of tips and tricks for any individual interested in this topic would be much appreciated.
I'd be happy to. I think that the story I like to tell people is that this job that I have right now at NASA, I didn't even know this job existed. And so if you look at my resume, it might look like I was preparing for this job, but that's simply not the case. I was pursuing my interest in space medicine. I was trying to find the intersection between my clinical work as an emergency medicine doctor and my research interest in practicing medicine in austere environments. And by doing so, I started to develop graduate courses on human health and space. I helped develop a fellowship program, a subspecialty training program for doctors in austere medicine. And I started to publish research and do work with students and other interested parties to try and become involved in this field. But I didn't have an ultimate destination in mind because, again, I didn't know this job existed. So I was simply doing the work that I was passionate about and interested in. And by doing so, I started to connect with a larger community of people who had similar interests to me. And I think that's a big part of how I've ended up where I am today in my career is I always went out looking for my people. And as I found them, I started to build communities and networks that I could work in and with people who shared my same interests. And so whether that was going to the International Space University and finding a whole bunch of space nerds to learn all about all the different aspects of space as a domain, or whether it was joining the Aerospace Medical Association and meeting all of these physicians and other clinicians who work with people in aviation and space medicine. All of that effort ended up with me finding this NASA job and being selected for it, but it was never the ultimate goal. So I think my biggest piece of advice to people in general is to pursue the area that you're passionate in, even if you don't know where you're going to end up. As long as you're doing everything you want to do and are moving in the right direction for you, you'll be amazed at what opportunities will present themselves in the future.
Wow, those are some really golden nuggets here that you shared with us. I'm very, very pleased that you joined us here at Space Talk with American Astronautical Society, Dr. Lehnhardt. And it was a pleasure talking to you about these intriguing and fascinating topics. Thank you very much, and I wish you the very best in all your future endeavors.
Thank you, Amir. It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.